interesting. Kemi Badenoch insists that slavery only had a minor role in Britain's wealth. The business secretary has said that free markets and liberal institutions were far more important in powering the Industrial Revolution, and endorsed a book which says slavery was no more important to the economy than sheep farming. Joining me now, Maurice McLeod, the anti-racism activist. Maurice, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ian. How are you doing?
I'm good. Always good to get your take on these things. Well, response firstly to what Kemi Badenoch has said on the issue of slavery.
It's a bit tiring, really. I saw it, and my first thoughts were, why is she saying this? What's the purpose? She jumped on this report, which is like I would suggest a bit of an outlier, because it sort of backs up her idea that slavery and colonialism, all that stuff, isn't really that important, and we should not be talking about them.
I suppose, and I think where she's coming from, and I don't know this, is that, of course, slavery was horrific, and that shouldn't be forgotten in the same way that we try to also mark and remember and, I hope, educate people about all sorts of other misdemeanors and abuses of this magnitude. But I sense her point is that why are we talking about it today? It doesn't impact today. No one alive today is affected by this. Most black people who live in this country are not necessarily affected by it. Not everybody has the same legacy, etc. We shouldn't be living our life by something that happened hundreds of years ago, essentially.
That might be what she's trying to say. And what she actually said was that, the impact or the economic impact of slavery and colonialism on Britain wasn't that much, which, virtually every bit of research, the Centre for Economic Policy Research early this year put out a report talking about the impact of colonialism and slavery on boosting our Industrial Revolution. I don't see...
Wasn't there? I mean, I think another report I read sort of said yes, but it was centred around a few people. The rest of the country didn't all survive and dine out because of slavery. It was seen as an industry, as a horrendous word to use when talking about human beings, but that's how it was perceived. And in terms of everything else that was going on, where mills were being built, not all on the back of that other industry, slavery. Lots of other things were going on. We shouldn't pretend that our country was built on slavery, because it wasn't.
I think that's a good point. Most people in Britain, I'm talking about working class, average Britons, won't have been very involved in slavery at all. They may have been involved in the industries that were funded by slavery, the cotton that came over, that went to Manchester, that made the textile, that sort of stuff they may have been involved in. But you're right, the wealth from slavery was very, very much focused, as sadly wealth still is these days, in a very few hands. So if the point is that Britain as a nation didn't benefit as much as maybe we might think, that's probably true, because it was all hoarded by the industrialists and the capitalists.
Yeah. I mean, isn't the real story here, when I think about the era and what was happening in the 1500s, the 16s, the 17s, the 18s, etc., almost up to, what in the grander scale seems half an hour ago, weren't these eras of exploitation that extended? Slavery was one aspect of it, and a big aspect of it, but there was lots of other things going. The average working class person in this country in 1700, 1800 was having a pretty rubbish time. I mean, exploitation was the name of the game. If you were working in a mill, I'd imagine your human rights, your workers' rights were pretty much zero. I would imagine abuse, both in terms of violence, sexual abuse to women who worked in those places, was off the scale. Kids were sent up flipping chimneys, for God's sake. So whether you were sent in a boat to the United States to pick cotton, or whether you were shoved up a chimney in Grimsby, no one, black or white, was having much of a good time back then.
I think I agree that most people were having an awful time. I think you've got to make a distinction, though, between what slavery was and, to be honest, any other form of economic oppression. Slavery, it's a different level of of oppression, if you're talking about generations of your family not being able to ever be free and knowing that you'll never own anything, knowing that your families are going to be broken up, that you'll be habitually raped and beaten, that's very different to, to the awful things that were going on with the British working class at the time. I don't think those two things can be.
No, they're not complete equivalencies, but they are sort of from the same narrative, I suppose, Maurice, in the sense that, the whole world was, we can. I'm already getting texts from people saying, "What about, ask Maurice about the Barbary pirates and things like that." Of course, there were whites taken. White Europeans, I think it was 10, 12,000 from this country that were taken as slaves as well. Again, I'm not suggesting that was as big, but this isn't about a game of size, isn't it? It's not about who's the worst exploiter it shouldn't be a league table in that sense. There were just terrible things going on, not in terms of slavery, in terms of, there was no equality. There was no equality at all. And class and the proletariat and the exploitation were just the way the entire planet did business then.
And I don't think it's massively different now. We might not have the extremes of slavery going on in the scale that it was going on back then, but we still have massive exploitation. Both, look what we're doing to the global south right now. So yes, I completely agree. It's about inequality, and inequality still exists today.
But was it, in the grander scale, was the impact that it had then, is that any worse today for, other people who will tell similar stories about their own background? Whether it's Jews and the Holocaust, whether it is working classes. Some people, I heard a fellow the other day, and I've referenced this before, the subjugation of the country by the Romans, for goodness sake. We could go on. What point do you cut it off and say, OK, no one around today experienced any of this stuff, the Holocaust aside, because there are people around today who did. But broadly speaking, those horrendous eras of exploitation in all its varying forms, most people today do not have that backstory.
Sure, they don't, but we're still living in the world that those horrors created. And so if we don't fully acknowledge that, if we can't...
But we do acknowledge that, don't we? Nobody's saying slavery... I'm sure there are one or two chancellors at the back who will say, no, it was all made up. Those people exist. You've only got to look at Twitter. But broadly speaking, we acknowledge it. We all know it was terrible and horrendous. No one is proud of it, I don't think. But in terms of living our life by it, reparations and goodness knows what else, why would we still be doing all of that in the 21st century?
We haven't even got to apologies yet, to be honest, and let alone reparations. And you say no one's trying to play it down. That's exactly what I'm on here talking about, is Kemi Badenoch saying, oh, no, it wasn't that important a part of our economy or whatever. So people absolutely are trying to play it down, sadly.
But isn't she just responding to what she would say is an exaggeration of a story that really doesn't need any exaggeration because it's so bad? But let's not try and make it badder to make the story, somehow more powerful. It's already bad, but the entire country wasn't built on slavery. That would be madness to say it was. Let's call it for what it was, a horrendous experience for many, many people over lots and lots of years, as you rightly say, generations that went through this. But the idea that the entire country was built on it is just not true. And in fact, it's not even mostly true. It's a little bit true.
Nobody said the entire country was built on slavery. Unless you're talking about the United States, then you could make that argument. Nobody said that Britain was built on slavery. I think the argument was that the Industrial Revolution was turbo boosted by the money that came in from slavery. I think that's undeniable.
But her point, I sense, is that it was a minor role rather than a major role.
Well,
in fact, I think they were her words.
Well, then, sorry to say, she's wrong. She's wrong, and I think she's wrong deliberately, to be honest.
She's a black woman, of course, for those who don't know who Kemi Badenoch is.
What's the relevance of that?
Well, she would have a story that I haven't got in terms of her experience of discrimination and understanding what can happen to somebody due to their skin colour. Somebody might think that would be a game changer on how you perceive it.
We were talking about transatlantic slavery, which, as far as I know, Kemi isn't descended from. But this isn't really, I don't think, relevant to the conversation, whether she's descended from slaves or not. I don't think that's I don't think that's the.
I think some people would argue that if a black person makes that comment, whether they have her view or your view, that is, I don't think qualified is the right word, but it is more understandable that you might have emotions around it that I wouldn't have, for example.
I should think all humans would have emotions about 300 years of forced slavery, rape, and oppression.
Well, we'd hope you'd have the same opinions
that or
about it.
not.
Yeah, well, of course, everybody would have the same opinion on the facts of the matter. In terms of, it's kind of in the ballpark of if somebody in your family is affected, if somebody's in extended family is affected, and if you are part of a minority, and it's a minority, it wasn't a minority in Africa where people were being nabbed from, but certainly a minority in the grander scale, then people from whatever group it happens to be would perhaps have a bigger emotional input into that argument. I mean, I think that's my perception as a white bloke.
I'd like to think we all care as humans. I don't need to be from Gaza to care about what's happening down there at the moment.
But I think you'd probably care more if you were, if that makes sense. Listen, Maurice, I hear what you're saying. Maurice McLeod, anti-racism activist with us here on Talk TV. 0344